Welcome to Tomversations, a monthly conversation with me, your host, Tom Hollingsworth, on a variety of enterprise IT topics that I find fascinating and want to dig into just a little bit deeper. Thank you for joining me this month, and I would like to talk a little bit about security, and specifically about critical, important targets that could potentially come under attack. Now, if you've been paying attention to the news in 2021, you have no doubt heard that ransomware is out of control. It went from being something that would occasionally lock a couple of files or potentially be involved in, some minor enterprise havoc to crews that are trying to target important things, that are locking down entire companies that are global in nature, or as we found out with things like Colonial Pipeline, targeting people who are very important to the operations of a country or of an economy. And it's interesting to see that these shifts are starting to happen. Many years ago, I wrote an article for the Aruba Airheads forums where I talked about the idea of a Cyber Geneva Convention, where we would agree that certain targets were off limits, certain things that we wouldn't attack because it was just too much of a risk. And when I wrote that article some 8 years ago now, my hope was is that we would all kind of agree that while there are crews out there that are going to create ransomware and sometimes they distribute it without cause or care for where it lands, that there were certain things that were not going to be attacked. Now, unfortunately, as we found out with ransomware like Conti, that's not the case. As a matter of fact, this year has seen a number of news articles posted in a variety of forums about ransomware that is specifically targeting hospitals, that are locking hospital systems and attempting to extort money from these organizations. And you know why they're doing it? Because it works. If you lock down a school, it makes it difficult for the teachers to do their jobs. If you lock down a meat packing facility, well, you may not get to have hot dogs for your next holiday cookout. But if you lock down a hospital, people will die. That's as cut and dried as you can be. If you take machines offline, people will be unalive when you are done. And do you know what that means? Hospitals will pay. It's similar to the theory of why do you kidnap a billionaire's son? Because the billionaire will pay. And that's exactly what's going on with hospitals. They will do everything they can to make sure that the people in their charge are still alive at the end of the day. And they're also trying to stay out of the news. And any organization that gets embarrassed, especially by things like security failures, will definitely do everything they can to stay out of the news as much as possible. The problem is that as soon as the ransomware crews that are writing these tools figure out that hospitals, one, want to stay out of the news, and two, will pay to make sure that that happens, they're going to start targeting them more and more and more. And that's what's going to lead to an even bigger expansion of the problems that we are going to see from these ransomware crews. So what happens when the target is critical infrastructure, but it's not critical for people to stay alive at the first? What about a hydroelectric dam or a nuclear power plant? And before you waggle your eyebrows and say, well, no one would ever go after those, well, you might want to do a little research on Stuxnet, one of the most famous pieces of malware ever created. Now, ostensibly, Stuxnet was created by government agencies for a very specific purpose, but the fact is that it still targeted a nuclear facility. Now, it didn't target the actual nuclear facility itself. It targeted very specific infrastructure inside of it designed to produce a specific result that was not going to cause a disaster. That was something that the people involved in creating it specifically wanted to do. What happens when the people who do that are a little less noble and a little more interested in making sure that they get paid? I don't necessarily think that the term cyber Chernobyl would be good on anybody's news blotter or in the lead of a story. And I can guarantee you that somebody is going to try to prevent that from happening. Oh, but you might say, well, as soon as you start messing with the power grid, you're going to get all kinds of government agencies involved. The Department of Energy and other government agencies like Cyber Command are going to come after these folks. Yeah, you're right. Same thing happened with Colonial Pipeline earlier in 2021. Remind me again how many arrests have been made because of the Colonial Pipeline attack? I'm going to guess zero. And depending on when you watch this video, it could very well still be zero. Because as it turns out, while Cyber Command is very good at going on the offense against the attackers, they're not so good at rooting them out to the point where they can be arrested either by the FBI or by local officials, because most often these people are nowhere near the US. And ransomware crews have figured out that once they hit a hard target and get paid, they need to go to ground instantly. They need to disappear into the shadows until the heat dies down. And if you think that hacking a pipeline and making CNN was one thing, imagine what would happen if you shut down a hydroelectric dam and blacked out the Western US, or you caused a minor meltdown or a major meltdown in a nuclear facility. They would never stop hunting for you. But if you got your ransom, well, would you even care at that point? The end result of all of these cyber crews that are creating ransomware is ultimately because they want to get paid. We've seen a shift in the tactics that they're going after locking up files and then threatening to release those files if they don't get paid, threatening to release the files if they bring in negotiators because they're not going to get paid nearly as much. Money has been the driving factor for this. If you think all the way back to the 90s and the early 2000s, it wasn't about money. It was about cred. It was about proving that you were capable of doing something and showing that you were elite. And now it's a business. But sooner or later, it will no longer be a business. Eventually, it will become something more sinister. We saw in 2020 how assets in Eastern Europe were able to infiltrate SolarWinds and deposit malware that allowed them to breach a significant number of systems outside of SolarWinds. Those attackers invaded, figured out what they were capable of accessing, put in their technology, and then laid low for months. According to most reports, even though we found out about the SolarWinds hack thanks to Mandiant and FireEye sometime in November or December of 2020, in fact, the attackers have been inside the SolarWinds network since March. You can do a lot of damage in 9 months. What if the target wasn't a company like SolarWinds? What if the target was a defense contractor? What if the target was a government agency? And we've heard a lot this year about how government agencies are getting poor report cards because they're being hacked left, right, and center. In fact, according to a news report that we put out on the Gestalt IT Rundown earlier this year, the only organization in the surveyed uh, departments of the US government that actually got a grade above a C was the Department of Homeland Security. And by all reports, the only reason that DHS got a passing grade was because they were the newest organization on the block and still weren't trying to run technology that was made back in the 80s or earlier. What happens when crews that are, if not sponsored by nation states, at least protected by them, decide that money isn't the objective anymore, that they're preparing for something even more grand? So they infiltrate these systems. Rather than locking up your files, they plant malware. They plant some kind of remote exploit for them to be able to get back into the system later. Could you imagine how brave another nation might feel if they knew they had the ability to wreak absolute havoc on the defense capabilities of someone? Could you imagine a foreign power suddenly deciding to retake a disputed territory, knowing that on the day they decided to do it, they could effectively shut down the capability of that territory to defend themselves? Or worse yet, if there were treaties involved, they could shut down the capability of those treaty partners to even respond. Here's an even worse thought. What if the money no longer becomes an issue because money really doesn't have a lot of value? We've seen this before with the stock market. Even the hint that someone has the capability to get into our financial and economic bastions scares the living daylights out of people. Financial tech is one of the most regulated industries out there. So, what happens if a foreign state decides that they're just going to wreck the whole system? We might be able to recover. We might be able to unpack all of the things that are going on, but not before there is a significant amount of economic chaos that gets caused. And that's the kind of thing that scares me a lot because we are not protecting these targets the way that we should, because we are not developing the technologies and we are not creating the policies that allow them to be off limits. Yes, we do a really good job of protecting certain assets. I have no doubt that the teams that run the NYSE or other Wall Street firms or even defense contractors and possibly even the Pentagon are the best in the world at what they do. But to quote a famous line from the IRA as said to Margaret Thatcher, you have to be lucky every day. We only have to be lucky once. And ultimately, that's the problem. Playing defense means that you have to be lucky every day in order to be able to prevent these people from getting into the system. Because if they are able to get access, referencing the SolarWinds issue, what happens if their luck emboldens them to do something else? What if instead of holding the US power grid for ransom, they just decide to shut it off in the middle of a cold snap? We've seen that before when the Texas power grid failed in early 2021 in the middle of one of the most historic cold weather events in history. And it cost people their lives and it cost a lot of chaos and it will cost a lot to recover. And that was something that was an accident. What happens when it's on purpose or a coordinated attack? Here's a scary thought. What if the US government's policies on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency trading suddenly cause the people who are requesting those assets to decide to burn the entire system to the ground? And after that system is burned to the ground and there's chaos everywhere, a nation state decides to flip on their deep cover assets, their software penetrations into the defense of some other country and take advantage of that. And by the time we're done sorting out the pieces, we have a geopolitical nightmare on our hands. Sounds like the plot of a movie or a video game, doesn't it? Well, those plots are usually inspired by real life events. I'd rather not find out about that. I know that this episode's been a little bit more dark than others, but that's one of the problems that you face when it comes to security is that you have to be thinking about these darker timeline type of things. Because if you believe that everyone out there has their best interests in mind, well, then you wouldn't have a need to lock your doors at night. Unfortunately, when it comes to cybersecurity, we need to lock the doors and the windows and put an alarm system up and buy a guard dog and possibly have some people drive by the house every once in a while to try out all those doors and windows to make sure that they're properly locked. And that is a great metaphor for the way that you need to build your security. You need to constantly be vigilant and you need to constantly be testing yourself. I hope that this episode of Tomversations has been one to enlighten you a little bit and hopefully get you thinking about some interesting things about security. Make sure you check out the rest of this series. You can head over to gestaltit.com and look for Tomversations. We have 20 or more episodes out there right now on a variety of topics ranging from networking to security to wireless to emerging tech. We record a new episode every month and publish it here on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/gestaltitvideo. And I welcome your comments. What do you think about the topics that we discuss here on Tomversations? Do you think that the idea of hacking infrastructure targets like power generation or hospitals or even Wall Street is far-fetched and that could possibly never happen? Let me know. I'm always interested in having a great conversation with you. We'll be back next month with another great topic, and I look forward to having the opportunity to sit down and chat with you. Till then, thanks for watching.